Okay, well, I'll go ahead and kind of get us started. We do have interpretation again, so I'm going to let Valentina, who will be helping out with that, introduce herself, and then I will hit start when she's done with a few logistics for that. And then just as a reminder, I guess the meeting is being recorded as well, so you should have been alerted to that when you joined on. But with that, Valentina, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Laura. Hi everyone, my name is Valentina and I'm here on behalf of Community Language Co-op, here to guarantee your commitment to language justice. Language justice is a type of simultaneous interpretation that seeks to create spaces in which no one language is dominant, spaces in which everyone can participate with the language of their hearts. So as a brief reminder, to achieve this objective, we will be using Zoom's interpretation feature. And what you will see in a couple of minutes is that a new button that looks like a little globe will appear at the bottom of your screen, right on the bar of the mute and the video and all of those buttons towards your right hand. When you see it, go ahead and click on it and select either English or Spanish as your preferred language for tonight's session. If you're joining on a phone or on a tablet, you will find the same options by clicking on the button with the three little dots in the lower right-hand corner of your screen that reads More. Yes, Christine, I can speak louder. Can you hear me better?
Can hear you, it's just different from Laura. And so we'll have to go back and forth adjusting her.
Okay.
That's better, closer is better.
I'm closer to the mic, so hopefully
Thank you.
That'll do it. You're welcome. Hola a todos, a todas y a todos. Mi nombre es Valentina y estoy aquí por parte de Community Language Co-op para ofrecerles y garantizar su compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje. La justicia del lenguaje es un tipo de interpretación simultánea que busca crear espacios en los que no dominen ningún idioma, espacios en los que todas puedan participar con el idioma de su corazón. Para lograr este objetivo y con un pequeño recordatorio vamos a utilizar la función de interpretación de Zoom. Lo que verán en un par de minutitos es que aparecerá un nuevo botón que parece un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla, en la barra donde está el micrófono y el video y todos esos botoncitos. Va a estar hacia la derecha. Si está, cuando aparezca, haga clic en él y seleccione inglés o español como su idioma preferido para esta sesión. Si está en un teléfono o en una tableta en esta reunión, encontrará las mismas opciones haciendo clic en el botón que tiene 3 puntitos en la esquina inferior derecha de su pantalla y que dice More o Más. Another thing to keep in mind is that I am interpreting simultaneously, and Spanish is 20 to 25% longer than English. So please be aware of your speed and of your clarity. And everyone, please do remember to mute yourselves if you're not participating to avoid that any background noise that we are all experiencing interferes with the interpretation. If you have any questions or any trouble whatsoever with this technology, please let me know by means of the chat box so that we can all work together to resolve whatever issue there might be. Un par de recordatorios es que estoy interpretando de manera simultánea, así que por favor tenga un ritmo conversacional y por favor silencie su micrófono para evitar que cualquier ruido de fondo que todas podemos estar experimentando interfiera con la interpretación. Si tiene alguna pregunta o algún problema con esta tecnología, por favor comuníqueselo a todo el grupo a través del chat. Listo, vamos a activar los canales. Okay, Laura, let's go ahead and turn the channels on and make sure that they're working correctly.
Let's try again. The box is grayed out, so let's there.
I see the button, but I wasn't invited to be the interpreter. Can we try that again?
Try this again. Sorry, everyone.
There we go.
Okay. Great. All right. And with that, I guess we will start it off. I think our first topic tonight, make sure I can pull up our agenda, is the OU timeline.
Let me turn my camera on.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, that's on. Yeah, okay, that's good. And actually, I'm gonna turn it off because this is just gonna show up on something on the screen. I just realized, yeah, you guys don't need to see me, so see you in a little bit. Okay. So I prepared a.
Jesse, hold on. I just wanted to make sure. I just wanted to say hello to everybody, this community advisory group, because we're a community. And I just wanted to make sure that we all say hi. And I just wanted to connect with folks in the Zoom room. I appreciate folks being on. I appreciate you, Joan, for being here, and Yarira's chiming in. And Chuck's on the phone. Mary's here. Adrian and Christine. Alma, I understand that Nola told me that you would be here and said that you'd be here in kind of in her place to kind of get some information and do some information sharing. Could you just kind of give us do you want to just say hi real quick and kind of introduce yourself?
Yes, let me turn the camera on real quick.
Okay. Hi.
My name's Alma Urbano. I've been involved with that coalition, GS coalition, for a while, but I've recently become staff. So yes, here to learn more, take some notes, and if there's anything that correlates with the coalition, or I'll point it out. But thank you.
Thanks, Alma. Cool. Anybody else want to say anything or have any hellos or quick connections they want to make?
I just want to say that your voice is low as well. And I do know how to adjust my volume, but then is anybody else finding that Rachel is lower volume, or is it just me?
I'm happy to project. Is this better,
Yeah.
Christine?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm constantly told I'm yelling, so I'm trying not to yell. So yeah, I'm happy to project more. Thanks, Christine, for letting us know. All right, thank you for that brief pause. Jesse?
Okay. Okay, and this is not where it needs to be. Okay, there it is. Now this is where it needs to be. So this is the schedule, a tentative schedule, my best guess of where I think the site will move through the remedial investigation phase and making, a guess to reach the record of decision stage. That's a document that tells what is the solution for the site, what is the alternative that we'll use to remediate the site, and then move on to the actual remediation of the location. So where we are today, we are in the remedial investigation phase. That phase, it's where we collect information to figure out where the contaminants are on the site, how they move. And the first portion of that sampling, I expect that will happen this summer. Then the plan that we have is that we were going to collect at least a year of groundwater sampling, and actually this groundwater and surface water sampling is both of them. That sampling, or that groundwater sampling, will happen at the same time. That first sampling that is going to happen in 2022 will give us more information that will help us direct additional sampling that will happen throughout what I think is going to be at least 2 more years of sampling. And I think that that will end in around 2024. After we finish that data collection, the next step is the feasibility study. And what we do there is that we look at different alternatives using that information to give us an idea of what is the alternative that would be the best solution for the site. My best guess of that, sometime in 2025 when we'll have that document. After the feasibility study is done, what we do is that we put out the proposed plan, and that goes out to the community, and it says, we perform this investigation, we look at different alternatives, and this is the alternative that we think is going to be best for the site. We put that out for public comment, and after we get public comment, we respond to that, and we either go back and submit a new proposed plan, and then at some point, once that's completed, we'll issue the record of decision with the alternative that was selected in the proposed plan. And again, my best guess is that sometime in 2026 when that's going to happen. So that's the schedule for operable Unit 2.
Jesse, do we have a map of that? I know that most of us that are here do know where that's at, but I know that Alma, I don't think she's ever joined a meeting for this. So that way she'll know what operable Unit 2, where it's at.
Sure.
Thank you.
So let me actually change the layer. Change the base map actually to the streets. And then I would change it back to the area for the rep. So that you have an idea of where we are. Denver Zoo City Park is over here. The 16th Street Mall is out here. This is where the Denver Coliseum is, I-25 and I-70. National and Western, it's all of this area. OU2 is the parking lot that is behind the Denver Coliseum. And what I'll do is I'll change again to the imagery and then do a little zoom. This is a closer look at where OU2 sits today. The Denver Coliseum, the I-70, train tracks, the South Platte River, the Globeville Landing Park, the Pepsi property, and Brighton Avenue. National Western sits just to the north of the property. This is the National Western.
So Jesse, just to be sure, people see operable Unit 2 actually includes a number of businesses along Brighton and operable and some of Pepsi's parking lot and building, but are you only working on the principal responsible parties land, which is the Coliseum and the parking lot?
No, we're working in the OU2 section, which is this purple area.
Thank you. Jesse, there's a couple of other questions in the chat.
Oh, let me check. What will they analyze in the samples? Is the question from Adrian. Adrian, we're looking for volatile organic compounds. We're looking for metals, semi-volatile compounds too. There's a bigger list. You know, it's a long list. The details of exactly what we're going to sample, it's included in the scope, and there you can check, you know, everything that we're going to do.
That pretty much answers my question. I wasn't sure if you were restricting it to metals only, since it's close to Globeville. So actually, that's quite an extensive analysis. Thank you so much for that.
Sure. And the types of sample, you know, now let me just, okay, there it is. Okay, so here it is. This is just to have an idea of the scope of sampling. We're going to do groundwater, and that's going to happen every quarter. We're also going to collect surface water, also quarterly. We'll collect sediment samples along the South Platte River. Throughout the property, we're going to collect soil samples and soil vapor too. Then, Christine, development of remedial before getting. What about development of remedial options before getting to the proposed plan? Can you talk a little bit more about the question? I'm not sure I'm getting the meaning of the question.
I thought after the remedial part, the investigation is complete and the feasibility is complete, I thought that we're all going to look at what possible remedies could be chosen for the site before you pick a proposed plan and suggest it.
The feasibility study, one of the things that happens during the feasibility study is that we check several different alternatives that will work at the site. And we pit them together, pretty much. And the study will say, the good and the bad about it, and we recommend one of them. That is the one that we'll put in the proposed plan.
And I know we don't want to stay here a long time, but does the city and county of Denver and the other owners get a say in choosing the remedy?
The remedy is chosen by EPA.
By who?
By EPA.
Okay.
So I'm interested, I don't mind staying here for a minute because, and I would love to hear from Chuck on this as well, just looking at that area and looking at the fact that the city has literally paved over problem areas, created whole drainage systems because of the trap, the unincorporated, or whatever the official title of it, trash, the landfill that was there. I'm very troubled that this is happening, that this is in the works for the future. And I'm wondering, like, what, I see the surface water is going to be looked at, which we can already see that there's stuff that's being leached into the water, into the river there. And then there's also the venting that's over there to get rid of some of these gases that are coming up from the landfill. So I feel like the city's done a lot to cover this up. So from your perspective, from an EPA perspective, how do you go about will the city be held accountable, and or will there be, like, how do you do this kind of process, essentially, considering these things have been kind of covered over? And do you go in and break up concrete? Do you take up a chunk of Pepsi? You go underneath these businesses, I'm curious because things seem pretty solidified there. So how deep do you go? And Chuck can definitely chime in here as well, because I'm just really trying to understand sort of what's going on here.
I guess I'm going to break your question into different, let's say, areas. And one area is investigation, and another area is going to be the decision to clean up the site, the remedy for the site, the decision of the remedy for the site. During investigation, we go and sample the area that we think it's going to hold the contaminants. That sampling expands or contracts so that we can determine the extension of the contaminants. And that happens to the depths that it's needed. It will also happen through different media. It will happen through concrete, there's equipment that we can just break the concrete and collect soil samples from below it. So sampling, just because it's covered, it's not necessarily something that will immediately say we cannot take a sample there. Well, if it's 2 feet of concrete, maybe that will become difficult to core through that 2 feet of concrete. But usually a sidewalk that is just a couple of inches thick, you can just punch through it with equipment and then continue to collect samples from below it. So sampling can happen. The other aspect, it's what is the remedy and how is that selected? When you have areas that are paved over, when there's buildings, there's business, that are there, infrastructure that is there. And the remedy decision looks at exposure. How is people going to be exposed to the contaminant? And cover might affect that decision. So if you have a building and underneath that building there is contamination that we cannot reach and we cannot address, that is something that is taken in consideration, but it's so is the fact that there is a building on top of that contamination. And how is the contaminant below that available to the people that are around it? Some of those contaminants are simply sitting there, metals are one example. They're just sitting there. And when there's a building on top of that with a couple of different covers, concrete, and maybe different levels, there's, the exposure that you'll get, it's gonna be pretty minimal. We can assume that the regular people will not be exposed to it, and what we'll expect is that a worker, someone that somehow breaks the concrete and do some kind of investigation, not investigation, repairs, if there's utilities, those persons can be exposed. It also means that you just don't forget about it. We know that the contaminants are in there. So there's a note made, there's where institutional controls come in that say, if you remove this cover, actions need to be taken. But metals are an example of something that it just don't move. If this were a volatile chemical, something that will seep, will create, it will evaporate and will go into the air, that contaminant can sometimes move. And so that means that it can move and it may go through cracks in the floor. And this is something that happens with radon. Radon, something that is common here in Colorado. People that have radon in their homes, well, radon will seep through their basement. And what they do to remediate that is that they put a a venting system that will take the radon outside of the houses, preventing exposure to it. So that's why I say that development, or not development, the remedy will look at risk, and that cover will play a part into it, understanding what is the exposure, what is out there, and sampling. The cover, it still plays a part into how we can access to collect a sample below some places that are covered, but it won't necessarily impede the sample collection.
So there's a couple of questions. Joan asked, can Pepsi sell the property before the IRFS? What about Pepsi parking? And why did the first remedial investigation of 2009 not move forward?
Development questions, if it's okay with you, that was a section that I kind of placed on a separate section because that was one of the questions that Christine had. And they are a bit more broad and they would apply to OU2 and OU3. So if we can just answer them just a little bit later so that we can go through all this. It's a more generic, I guess, discussion that applies to OU2 and OU3. Is that okay? Or do you want me just to go ahead and answer it now?
Well, I think that the first question, can Pepsi sell the property, is a pretty straightforward yes or no.
Yes.
They can, okay? And the Pepsi parking.
What about, can they sell it?
Joan, do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. The, the entire area that is not considered the landfill, where the actual, and as Jesse has said, I mean, it's been built on top of, but there are sections like where the incinerator was in that parking lot area. There are some identified locations of contamination. So that's why I was just wondering, can Pepsi go ahead and continue? And is it just the building area? Pepsi owns a lot more than just the building. That's why I brought up the parking lot, where when you look at the remedial investigation of 2009 and some other visuals and maps, they found major contamination under the parking lot area where an incinerator was. And we've got the Coliseum area. So I understand about the revitalization of building on top of contamination. We can't tear Pepsi down the buildings unless someone else does not want to occupy Pepsi. As far as keeping it a building or a possible warehouse, like they've done at the Sarco Globe, to build on top of contamination with warehouses, etc. So that's why I was just wondering about the parking lot and what is identified as contamination, and a lot of where the homes or other businesses are beyond Pepsi that that it appears that there still was, according to the remedial investigation of 2009, there was a lot of contamination along the next to Pepsi, where there was a lot of other housing and businesses, and public service was in there. So that's all I wondered, if they could also sell their property where they might have to. I mean, I don't know if we're ever going to put tar back on top of the landfill and build a parking lot again. So anyway, that's all. I was just wondering if there is consideration of doing any sampling at the parking lot area then.
Okay. I guess I'll give you a more general answer. Any of these properties can be sold and bought. There's no limit that we can, there's no limit. Any of these properties can be sold and bought. Okay. Okay. And then the question about the first remedial investigation now moving forward. I think I don't know exactly what you mean. What I can say is that the first remedial investigation, EPA understood that information was missing about groundwater. And that's what we're collecting today. We're collecting not just groundwater, we're collecting a little bit more than just groundwater.
Jesse, can I ask you a quick question going back to your previous presentation, which, by the way, was excellent? When you're saying about buying and selling the property, didn't you say that if they bought the property that there is a fine? I think that, I wasn't sure if that's the word you used, but there is a condition that if it is contaminated, that they are liable. Is that the same for this?
Let me change to...
Is that the right term? I'm not sure if I'm using the right terms, but if you know what I mean.
Okay. Redevelopment. So we're talking about redevelopment. People can buy and sell properties that are contaminated. There is no limit that we have about it. What CERCLA says, it's about liability. Who gets to carry the burden It's pretty much what it is. And a potentially responsible party is anywhere that owns, operated, transported waste, treated waste in a site. And the ownership doesn't mean the person that owned just when the problem was occurring. It went forward. It went with anyone involved in that transaction or in the history of that location. Okay? Ozarko got this property in the 1900s. You know, these were two smelters. Why do we have Denver as a potential responsible party? Is because Denver bought it at some point. So they became an owner, and under CERCLA, well, they fall under the definition of a potentially responsible party. Sometime in early 2000s came the idea of all appropriate inquiry to prevent people that are buying contaminated properties from falling under the liability power of CERCLA. And what generally all appropriate inquiry says is you have to perform all the inquiry necessary to understand that environmental liability. If you perform it, then you are protected. Okay? And there are certain steps to do it. And that's how Congress work to make sure that none of these sites just kind of stay there dying. Because that's, you know, contaminated land at some point, people said, CERCLA is very expensive. We don't want to buy any of these properties. And those sites just kind of stood there, sitting there. And so there's no money to do work. The site it's just not, it's not in a good state to remediate it, pretty much. So that's what all appropriate inquiry means. Last time when I was mentioning it, one of the things about all appropriate inquiry is that you also have to comply with the remedy when the remedy is put in place. So if you don't do it, that protection that was built out for you falls down, and then you get exposed to liability. So it's not quite a fine. It's just that you have to make sure that if you buy any of this, that you follow all of the requirements that are under that rule. Did I explain myself okay, Adrian?
Yes, thank you so much. That's what I thought it was. So I appreciate that.
So I see Yadira.
Yadira's question? Mhm.
Yeah, the industrial zoning powers are not EPA powers. That it's for a local authority or a state authority. So we don't have a say in zoning.
The reason why I asked is because if for instance, let's say that this property gets sold privately, and I totally understand what you're talking about, that there's this protection for whoever privately owns it. The question would be then, because right now it is industrial zoned, right? And so let's just say that this private owner wants to build homes on it. And they want to submit the proposed plan now, but we still don't know all the contaminants that are on this land. And I don't know how backwards some developers can necessarily go back. Does that make sense? I'm just worried that the remediation that is going to be happening in this land, if it's going to be private sold, private bought, and they'll have to follow these protections. I just want to make sure that it'll be a healthy spot enough for people to be able to live in after the large contamination underneath the parking lot that sits underneath the Coliseum.
Okay. So I guess what you when we are selecting a remedy, when we are proposing, we're looking at possible alternatives. We look at what is the use of this property and the expected use of this property. In our case, if we think that this is going to stay in an industrial level, then we select a remedy that is for an industrial level. If someone buys the property and decides that they want to build residential, one of the things is that institutional control would say, this is an industrial property, so it's not set up for a residential. The developer can then say, how can I change that? What can I do? And then they can come and talk to us and see if it can be done. So a developer can buy it, and if a remedy was selected that was for the industrial use, and all of a sudden the developer just builds houses, that developer is not following the conditions that was set up the property and loses its protection. So it will open up to all of the liability that comes with CERCLA. So
Would the consequences mean tear down or take away?
I won't be able to say until that happens, but it just opens up liability to CERCLA. And that means, fines, penalties, doing work. It could be a range of things.
Well, has this ever happened in the past?
That someone buys stuff and then doesn't do?
That somebody purchases something, or that they build on contaminated land, or I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking of the possibilities, because I'm just thinking if they're just going to be hit with this large fine, but they've already built on this, that doesn't secure the lives of the people that are going to be living on there before. They're just going to pay this mega fine, and they're going to continue to go ahead and go forward with housing set on top of this contaminated land that eventually is going to kill tons and tons of people. No, so I'm just trying to think, what are these protections for something like this? What would this be if it's just going to be a big fine? And you're talking about market rate living. I'm sure that whoever's privately going to buy it might be willing just to pay the fine, but that doesn't protect the people.
Jesse, can I answer that question?
Go ahead, Fonda.
Yeah. So the institutional control is going to be placed on the deed of the property. So anyone buying that property is going to have that deed on there. It's going to say, let's say it's only commercial use. So if you were going to try to make that residential use, you have to petition the state to be able to do that. So you have to show that it's protected and all that stuff. Secondly, you're going to have to get permits. You're going to have to do a lot of things. So there's things in place. Example, like we have for the land use control plan that we have in Denver. If someone buys a property that wasn't sampled or was sampled in BBI 70 and tries to get a permit, it all stops because there's a deed on the property that says, hey, there's contamination here. We notify them that what they have to do, and that's how we take care of these properties. The same thing there with that deed. No bank is going to loan the money. The city will not issue a permit to have that also. So there's a lot of belts and suspenders here to protect people in the future.
Just to add in with Joan's comment, and then Christine, I want you to ask your question. The Pepsi, Denver sold the property to Pepsi, right? And so then, and Pepsi knew about it. So even though it may not have been residential, there's still employees working in this facility, and so it's not just a storage facility or something like that. There still is this impact to human health. And so I'm wondering, like within that context, like shouldn't Pepsi and or the city, like where does the responsibility lie here? Hold somebody accountable for building on a property that was already contaminated? Like where would you put accountability in this scenario?
Jesse, you want to answer that, or should I kind of get in that? What do you want to do?
I'm trying to figure out what the question is, because I can see one thing. Who is a potentially responsible party under CERCLA? And in our case, the potential responsible party is a list that, everyone that is involved in a site, whether they did it by actually creating contaminants, dropping contaminants in a property, or they did it through acquisition later on. So in that case, there is a list of different potential responsible parties for OU2. The one that we're going against is Denver. So if the question is who is the PRP, in this case it's Denver. If the question is a owner responsible, is a business responsible for contaminants in their property and the exposure to employees, that is more of an OSHA question. It's employee safety that happens through safety and health. So that's what I can tell you.
So I want to jump in. These are really great questions, and Yadira, back to yours. The truth is the city can rezone prior to this to an investigation being complete, prior to the remedies being explored. They can do that. So I think that we're probably what Jesse wants to talk about later, which is that the proposed use of the land will then determine how deep the cleanup is. So, but we are politically out of the circle. So say that you wanted to do housing, but you're not a big player and you're not Elevation or one of these guys who has a lot of money, you might buy the land subject to the current limitations and not be able to clean up to the standard to do residential because it's much higher. So it's really difficult. But my question is slightly different, and I guess I'm not quite sure why EPA's mission to protect health and protect the environment allows it to sit, and NOLA kind of asked this last time, sit on OU operable unit 2 until something comes up that one of the owners wants to do, which is what happened with the drainage Rachel was talking about. They wanted to help CDOT with its flood protection, so they agreed to do an action and dig up some of that land. Or in OU3, which we're going to talk about, something's come up. So it's really amazing to me that this has been investigated since 1992 or earlier, and then in the Superfund since 1999. And EPA, I guess I thought EPA was there to clean up land or to make the owners clean it up. But it seems to me, and this just may be the way the law is, that EPA doesn't have to do a thing until an owner wants to change the use. So that's correct?
Let's say that I'm going to differ. I'm going to explain think of it about resource management. The Vasquez Boulevard and I-70 Superfund site was separated into 3 different operable units. These are the 2 that we have, and these are the industrial locations. The larger portion was operable unit 1, and that was the residential portion. And when I say think of it about resource allocation, in that case, the risk was to residential, the lowest level, the most protected level that we have. So resources went to manage that larger portion. And this were left, for afterwards. Work at OU1 didn't finish until 2014. And it's still going on in the form of institutional controls. So yes, it's a long time, but there was a lot of work happening in a location that we thought that priority was needed, not in OU2 and OU3.
Jesse, one other thing that I would point out here too, what you have OU2 is thinking about it is exposure pathways. How are people actually being exposed to potential contaminants? So for example, OU2, a lot of it is paved over. So that exposure pathway is also blocked for a lot of the site as well.
Yeah.
So you're not having direct exposures where, you have the residential areas, you might have yards. So to Jesse's point, that's really where the focus needed to be.
I hear you. It's just that when CDOT started digging up, we didn't say, okay, now there's exposure there. So, we should probably not go into OU1 right now, but I do hear your answer, Jesse, that you made a priority, and that priority was OU1. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
And Yadira, I see the question about the park that was not paved, just like exposure. Where is the main need? It's a park, so the exposure there is less than what the exposure was at the residential location. So that's all it is. In the end, it's all about where do we allocate the resources that we have to make, the impact that we need at that time, and then we move to the other portions.
Also, the parks were sampled. It's not like they weren't sampled. So we did look at the parks for sampling too.
Even though, just because in the OU2 picture that you're showing, that park does come up there as being part of the OU2 and did have contamination. And that was an open park to tons of people, a lot of employees from the Pepsi company who spent a lot of time there. So Jesse, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the contamination levels there were a lot less, or I'm trying to understand that part.
Exposure. Think about headphones. Let's talk about headphones. Let's talk about a moment about headphones to try to make, explain what I mean better. You can use your headphones all day if you have a very low volume on them. Hear your music, very low volume, there is very little chance that you will damage your hearing. But blast them at high volume. How long do you think you'll be able to use those headphones without damaging your hearing? And that's what exposure is like. Residential, because you're living there, you're more exposed to that location than someone that is in an industrial location that goes there for only a portion of the day. So that plays a part in how is it that we go and think, where do we need to go? What do we need to do? Who gets exposed? And it's fun to say. We sampled the parks and there was no, that exposure that occurred, direct contact was lower. It's for people that only go there for a very small portion of time. So all of that plays out into our decision. Okay, welcome. And Christine, I see your hand up. Any other questions? Okay, well, Laura, I guess we can then move. Oh, Rachel, I'll see you. I don't hear you, Rachel.
Now?
Yep.
Okay. And this may seem ridiculous, but I think that I would want my hearing no matter what. So I would like all of my hearing, not just a little bit, not just a lot. I'd want all of it. So I'm in this, probably there's policy and law and everything else, and you can explain this to me, but how is it fundamentally different if the pollution is there and people are walking on it 20 times versus one time? It's still pollution that's there. It's toxic. And I'm struggling with this sort of like very inequitable kind of assessment of pollution.
What do you mean inequitable assessment of pollution?
That in one case, if it gets more traffic, like, you know, the park gets a certain kind of traffic, the employees in Pepsi, that's another kind of traffic. You know, human beings, where we also didn't really discuss the animal life that's there as well. All of these entities that are in this area that I'm really struggling with, that there's different sort of standards, like, well, it's an industrial, so we're not gonna be as stringent. If I'm using the correct word, in our assessment and or our cleanup and or our, you know, giving it the check, you're good to go. I'm struggling with that. Just that there are these dual systems in place based on exposure or perceived exposure, because, you know, we don't know. That park might become very, very resourced and lots of people there. So yeah, I'm just really struggling with this perceived notion of exposure and how that frames the cleanup and subsequent processes.
Exposure plays a part, because just like the headphones, when you have your headphones at very, very low level, the chance of you damaging your hearing so very low. So that's why you can use them for such a long time, not really damaging it. And think of that noise, of that sound coming out of the headphone as the contamination, as the pollution. And then if you have high levels, that creates a problem if you're hearing it for a long time, because it's going to damage your hearing. So is that analogy a good one?
Well,
I guess let me.
I hear your, and I think that's a fair analogy. However, that assumes that every single body responds to the sound the same. And what we know is that there are some populations of people, you know, if we'll just, I'm not sure about hearing science or whatever, but there could be populations of people who are particularly sensitive to sound. And the smallest little sound can cause irreparable kinds of harm. Yep. And so kind of having this different layer, these different, you know, perceived like use and perceived exposure seems to rest upon a certain assumption that isn't necessarily based in anything real.
Yeah, that plays out in the way that we reach a number. Suppose that there is okay, I'll give you an example with Colorado smelter. Colorado smelter, similar situation, smelter waste, we're doing residential cleanups. And some of the areas, like garden areas, those areas are sampled differently because the exposure there is different from the other traffic areas. So that way, we can tailor some of the different weights, different levels of sound to the actual use. So that plays a part in selecting the remedy, the levels that we use, and even the sampling strategy that we use. So it's not, I guess it's not as uniform. There's different parts that can tailor that response, that can tailor the investigation, and in the end can tailor what the remedy looks like.
I guess, I want to chime in a little bit more too, is that, you know, the way these cleanup numbers are established, you know, it's not just by EPA. There's epidemiologists who go through a whole scenario. Okay, is this acute exposure over a short period of time, or is this chronic exposure over a long period of time. And then they actually have, they set up I'm going to call it a formula of how they get those numbers, and it's based upon the worst case scenarios. In other words, give you an example, like for lead, how are those numbers based upon? It's based upon exposure of 30 years, you eat so much dirt, you're drinking water, you're in a smelter, so and you're a very susceptible person. So they actually do set the cleanup numbers and the basically the cleanup numbers based upon the worst case scenario of a exposure. So it's not like it's done just because, oh, that number looks good. There's scientists that go through I mean, you look at it, it's not a simple thing to do. It's actually a lot of exposure, it's a lot of math, it's a lot of different things that go on that determine that, but it's very, very detailed. It's not just like saying, oh, well, that's not bad. It's really, it takes a lot of time, people with PhDs to really come up with a number to determine that, or what is considered a safe level, because toxic is a relative term, okay? And what they're looking for, depending like on the situation with the residential area, that was a higher exposure scenario. They need to get to that first. Now the landfill, it's covered. What is the exposure scenario to the people? They did groundwater sampling based upon the initial groundwater sampling, which was not complete. They're trying to find, okay, what's in the groundwater? What's possibly leaching out to the South Platte River? And they look at all those deals, and based upon that, it gave us enough assurance to say, okay, this is not an acute exposure. It's not a chronic exposure. We can wait to determine what's going to be the best remedy on that. So it's not something that's, and that's part of the problem with Superfund, why it takes so long, is that we have a lot of people together looking at it and determining what is based upon science. And the science is something that's been going on for a long time. So in other words, point being is, we don't set the numbers. They've been set. It's like a speed limit rule. We set the speed limit. It's set by the state, and that will determine how fast your car can go. It's the same thing with us. We have to follow the rules that are given to us. Does that help a little better, Rachel? Okay.
And I see a message from Yadira that says that it feels like passing the baton. I don't remember when this happens. So can you say something about it, Yadira?
I'm just talking about how it just seems like the explanation that Fonda gave me kind of set me a little bit more at ease, but not really. I'm just saying, like, it just almost seems like the EPA passes the baton to the CDPHE, the CDPHE passes the baton to the EPA passes the baton onto the employee, and that the employee has to be responsible for F, Y, and Z, and then it just seems like it just keeps passing back and forth, just to say nobody wants to really be held accountable for the contamination that is there, that is harmful. And even though I appreciate Fonda's explanation, because I'm, that in some sort of way that makes a little bit more sense, because we're saying, how much does a person have to be exposed to this particular spot in order to know that it is going to be harmful to certain amount of people or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's contaminated land. And like he says, the word toxic is the word toxic. So it still puts fear into people, and then people feel like there's no protection. And that's where I'm saying it feels like the baton keeps being passed around, because we don't feel like there's that, like there's a protection. Like, for instance, this newer piece that we're talking about, the OU2, there's a protection in between parentheses, entre comillas, como luego se dice, but it's kind of a very small protection that's there, and it could easily go around. And yes, there's bumps and humps and, speed bumps that people are going to slow down to go through. But it seems like people in the development world, it seems like they're willing to go through all of that from what we're seeing, because Rhino is right across the street from OU2, and they're up moving, and they want that money and they want to build. And, I don't know. I just wish that there was a little bit more protection from the EPA, I guess.
Let me state one last thing. I worked out in the Osarco Globe neighborhoods the first 7 years. I was out there basically 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, sometimes more weekends, stuff like that. I was working in it as part of my part of the health and safety of the site. I had to get yearly and bi-yearly blood samples and urine samples to see exposure. What I'm trying to say is I would not have been working out there if it was not safe. I probably had more exposure than most kids have because I was in the areas of where they were working every day on the site, everything else. So it's not like we're passing the baton. We're working in those areas that you guys are living. So would I be working out there if I was concerned? Of course not. And I'm basing it upon the people who have. So when you say pass the baton, to me, it's I understand where the sentiment is coming from, but at the same time, it's not like we are not doing anything. We are doing the best we can to work with people and stuff, but we also have limitations of what we can do. To go to zero, there is no zero. It will never. Colorado is naturally elevated for arsenic and lead. It's going to happen. Doesn't matter. It's just no matter where you go, we know we're going to have anywhere from 10 to 20 parts per million of arsenic. We're going to have anywhere from 50 to 250 parts per million for lead. So zero is never going to happen. So it's a relative term. We have to get to an area where we feel comfortable, safe, that under the worst conditions, even the most vulnerable people are protected. And that's how we try to make our assessments.
So, Yadira, I think,
Good point, Vanda. Thank you for that.
and Yadira, I think there's one thing else that also plays out in this. It's, I guess, a little fear of the unknown, because we all hear the word toxic or toxins and we fear it. That's going to kill us. It's not. We don't think of it of any other ways. That's going to kill us.
Jesse,
And
maybe I could just point out where I'm coming from in contamination area. My life has been robbed due to so many areas, so many contaminations that I've been living. I didn't have quality of life. My children didn't have a quality of life. And maybe if we would have picked a different area to live in, I probably would have had a better quality of life. My children probably could have been out there playing sports. I don't know. They could have probably been playing football, no sé. You know what I mean? But because they're asthmatic and because all of the contamination that is in this area kind of played a big role in our lives, I guess that's where my fear is for the future of so many other people. But I see what Vanda's saying. He's saying that there's limitations. There's only so much that you guys can do. And like he's saying it's never going to be a zero. We're going to have to, our bodies are going to have to adjust to living with some sort of contamination. I just hope that the more vulnerable ones can pass it through. And I guess I'm not a strong one. My body wasn't strong enough because I got caught super simple and super fast and everything else, and it's just scary. It's scary, having to live your life at the hospital. And I'm not saying severe, like some of the people who have died, my neighbors who have died with cancers, but having to live in the hospital every day, I don't call that a quality of life. You going from one appointment into another. And so that's how come you try to join these types of groups to try to figure out what in my life can make a difference to help continuing to protect others, since I wasn't able to protect mine.
I understand you. I have similar life story, and the way I've done it is just like Fonda says, understand that there is no way we can do a zero. What can I do to protect myself wherever I am? So yeah, I can't say any more about it. I understand what you're saying.
Lots of really good statements and comments in the chat, just to kind of like reiterate what Yadira expressed. Thank you so much for that, Yadira, because, I feel like we're not necessarily, Pepsi doesn't go up and shoot people, but, just living in these areas, it's a slow death. It's a slow erosion of the quality of your life. And Mary and Yadira are both really good examples of how they're really been impacted. So for me, it becomes very disturbing that these numbers and the acceptable amounts, when we see our community members are absolutely affected, that doesn't seem to be taken into consideration. It just becomes like, this is the level, this is what we're going to do, done. And it also becomes sort of like, how little can we do? Instead of just, I mean, even like we were talking earlier about exposure, like, why not just assume that it's going to be residential and people are going to live and work in this area just intensively, and just assume it at that level and act at that level. That would be my, like, I think that's really where people are at. And then, I think that there's also just really good comments about there being no safe levels of some of these contaminants, of most of these, I would say all of them at this point. And as Alma also indicated, there's definitely some differences in sensitivities and those to some of these chemicals, and those are not considered as far as like marginalized communities and sort of some of the sort of over a lifetime accumulation that like Irina was expressing earlier, like maybe she would have moved and lived somewhere else, but couldn't really afford to do so. And so I think like lifetime exposure, there's a lot more at play here than just, do you just go to the park for 30 minutes or do you live here?
There are risk science is always evolving. Our understanding of risk is not the same understanding that we had 30 years ago. So every time we do an investigation, we're always using the latest understanding of risk. So that kind of alleviates the idea that we're just setting a number and just leaving it as it is. That's why not every site is the same. We always look at it. The sites sites that do not reach what we call the unlimited use level, which is the residential level. We go through an evaluation every 5 years. So we always look at this kind of considerations. How has the site changed? Is the site still protective? And we go back in if we need to. That's one of the requirements of CERCLA. When we look at a site, that exposure plays a big part. How are the people living there using the area? How are the people working there using the area? So that we can create those scenarios and in the end, minimize everything that we can minimize to make sure that a site is protective. The portion about environmental racism, CDPHE and EPA, now they both have a greater emphasis on environmental justice to address this kind of problems that existed for decades. So that also, it's also playing, actively playing a part out in what we're doing.
Jesse, you said that you guys are consistently often updating your numbers and evaluations.
Yeah, actually there is, just so you have an idea, there is something that is called the regional screening levels. It's a table that EPA puts out, and that one is updated every 6 months in April and November. So that we're always looking at different exposures. The information comes from many different agencies, and it's always about, different numbers of exposures to do.
Does the numbers that are consistently always changing. They're taking into consideration the illnesses that are running in the areas that you guys are working in? Or how do you guys come up with, you know, how do you guys come up with these evaluations? Are the numbers coming into evaluation due to your limits that you guys are only able to abide by, or can those get moved, removed? Can they go higher, go lower? Considering, like, let's just saying survey in some sort of way, no? That people there has to be a way that you guys are collecting the data, and you have to take things into consideration in order to evaluate numbers and processes or whatever the heck you do. And that includes how many years back, or is it a continuous thing? In the last 10 years, this type of enfermedades have been showing up for this site, and we have to reevaluate our numbers of what is safe. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
You're talking about a different kind of evaluation.
Okay.
These numbers are the numbers that we're using for a site. You know, it's exposure, what creates a negative condition for a person. And the RSL table, the regional risk screen level table, those are conservative numbers that are not set up to be cleanup numbers. They just say, look at this is an idea of when we need to start thinking about negative effects. And then we use that and the information and the way that those were calculated, and we go to the site and try to come up with a number that is specific for the site. And that's how cleanup number is set up. So we just don't pluck a number out of the air. There's more work that goes into putting a number at the site. I think but the kind of question, the kind of scenario you're posing, I think is a different type of assessment that doesn't play out into our numbers. The chemicals, there's the list, I don't know how long it is. I know it's several pages long of different chemicals that we look at. So, and they also have a negative consequence when you're exposed to it. And that is what we're looking for. What are the negative consequences of being exposed to this toxic chemical or this contaminant?
I don't want to completely miss the discussion of Fox Island and Operable Unit 3 simply because all the comments have to be in a couple of weeks, and this is our only chance to hear Chuck. And Jesse, I understand you can't talk too much about it, but I'd like to make sure we hear Chuck. And after you introduce, if it's okay with everyone, I think all these questions are really, really good. And I remember a big discussion we had about risk several years ago, and maybe we can revisit that at another meeting.
Yeah, I'm okay with wherever you guys want to go. I can show you the area of OU 3, so you guys are anchored. And since Chuck is on the phone, I can have it on a map, so you can, kind of see what he's talking, the area that he's talking about. Is that okay? Okay.
I'm ready to move forward because I got on mainly to hear about Fox Street. Thank you.
Okay, so let me share. Let me share the screen. Okay. So this is OU2. Oh, sorry, this is Operable Unit 3. it's sitting right similar to the center, sitting close to the center of the screen. You can see it's the purple area. That is the northwest corner of the I-70 and I-25, and just a little bit south of I-70 is the purple area. Just to touch a little bit about redevelopment, what happened here is that a developer proposed development in the southern portion. And EPA has this program that is called the bona fide prospective purchaser. Someone that wants to buy a property in a Superfund site. And the protections that I mentioned of the all appropriate inquiry come into play here. They get into an agreement with EPA to do some work. Usually this happens because EPA, it's what is called the lead agency. There is no potentially responsible party that can take on the cost of investigating and cleaning the property. So that goes to the government. When these companies come in, they know that they are developing in a Superfund area. They understand the risk. So what they try to do is they also try to have some certainty that they are not overstepping their boundaries. And we get into agreement that says, this is the area. If there is a remedy, then you have to follow this remedy. If we don't have a remedy, like it happens here, then we have, the bona fide prospective purchaser has to abide by the remedy, whatever remedy that we put in place. And work happens, they can do their development and continue to work. Also, just because it's a Superfund site, there is no prohibition on buying and selling property. So they can, that's what happens all around the country, and that's what's happening here too. So generally, that's what I can say. So the development is happening in this green portion. And what you see is the agreement itself, the bona fide prospective purchaser agreement, with the statement of work that the developer put out on the work that they plan to do.
Jesse, just can you outline all the properties? Is all the purple south of I-70 in the agreement?
To have, that's my best approximation, but the BFPP has the location.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone, this is Angela. I have a question. The GES Coalition and Global First were in talks with the Fox Street development people. And as far as I know, there was never any discussion of the contamination of the land, of it being cleaned up. So is it on the developer to let the community know that there is contamination there? Whose responsibility is that? And as of now, they still don't know. I spoke to some people in Sunnyside who were very upset that they had no idea that the land was contaminated. So again, my question is who does the developer have to let the community know that the land is contaminated, or do they just go along their merry way and we find out the way we found out?
Oh, sorry, was that Yadira?
Angela.
Sorry, Angela. Angela, I think you have a different question that is not about redevelopment of the property. It's about information. and I'm not quite sure how to answer it for you. The information for OU3 is available. We've known about it for a while. So I don't know. It looks like what you're saying is the developer needs to go out and say this land is contaminated, but that's not completely right.
So, the only reason I know about this is Fran invited me to participate, and I did, and the same with Adrian. She invited us both. But like the people who live closer to Fox Island, I don't think they know about it. I don't think there are other people in Globeville who know that, number one, that is a part of Globeville. And number two, that it's contaminated. And I guess it's going back to what, Yadira was saying earlier. How many people know about the history of what's happened here in GES? And who's supposed to tell us that these things, that we have dirty dirt, and how far it goes? I guess that's my main question, is like, whose responsibility is that? I would assume that if a developer is coming in, they obviously already know that the land is contaminated. So is it upon them to tell the community that they're going to be building? I mean, Fox Street has told us they're going to build apartments there, that they're going to put in retail. But again, no mention has ever been said of the contamination. And I guess that's part of my frustration, is when the developers come in, they don't tell us anything. They just tell us, we're going to build these things. And Fox Street has just been like, oh, we're going to be the greatest thing since chocolate and coffee and bread. And I guess, I don't know. That is my main question. Who is supposed to inform the community about the dirty dirt, the contamination, etc.? Who is that upon? Is that upon the developers? Is that upon DDPHE, CDPHE, the EPA? Where does that fall, so that people, when they move into this community, know where they're moving into? I'm hoping that's making sense. So I don't know. I'm just frustrated that Fox Street came in and was like Oprah, throwing money all over the place, and with no open discussion with they've basically been dealing with the community-based organizations that are in the community and not with the community. So I don't know, maybe I'm over talking and I don't understand myself anymore, but thanks.
So I think what you're mentioning, it's something that happens afterwards. The developer works, any BFPP, any bona fide prospective purchaser that enters into an agreement with us is doing work that is under supervision, under our agreement. And if and this all really depends on what's going to happen at a specific site. There may be a need for the developer to have plans in place to prevent exposure. There may be a need for a developer to do other actions, it really depends on a site. For the people that are on this island, these were people that were part of OU1, and these properties were investigated, and the ones that need a cleanup got their cleanup. So these people already had their evaluation done.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. So I can agree with that partly, Jesse. If those people were here when that cleanup happened, but if they moved and somebody else moved in, they don't know that. And I know they're supposed to be told, but that doesn't, let's face it, that doesn't happen. Nobody told my neighbor when she moved in next door to me that GES was a contaminated neighborhood.
So sorry, Angela. The point, I get the part that you're missing is, if there was no need for cleanup, they don't need, there's no more information that needs to move beyond that. because it was investigated, it didn't need a cleanup. And if it needed a cleanup and it was remediated, then the same thing, there's nothing. The ones that need to know that there was something there, that there is something there that could be a risk, are those people that go into a property that the owner at the time of the cleanup denied access for investigation or for cleanup. Those are the ones that need to know. The other ones, the risk is not there. So they don't need to worry about the Superfund side because the risk is not there for them, for those properties.
Okay. All right. I guess I'm not making myself clear, but that's all right.
Just to clarify, so this developer probably knew from the very beginning, right? When they were looking at the property to even consider it to purchase, they would have been informed or found out somehow that it was a Superfund or OU1 side.
This is OU3.
Yes.
Yeah, the developer knew. That's why they get into an agreement with us. We don't go to them. They come to us. So the developer, during their all appropriate inquiry, found out that this portion of the property, or at least this portion of the property, sits in a Superfund site.
So when he reaches out to you, when these people reach out to you, and now you're telling them that they're in a Superfund site. Oops, sorry. And they tell you what their plan is for the future. Then you tell them what type of remediation has to happen. No?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, no, sorry. You're partially right. If there is a record of decision, that is information that the developer will know. So they will know that they will have to abide by whatever remedy there is. But if there is no record of decision, then we can't tell them what the remedy is because we don't have a remedy. And in any bona fide prospective purchaser site, you can always take protective measures. And that's why one of the conditions in this kind of agreement is that the developer has to agree with whatever remedy we put in place, because whatever happens during the site may need additional protections. Because we really don't know what is the remedy at that point in time.
So this question is more for Angela and Alma. Do you guys know when Fox is going to be building? Or if they're going to be building anytime soon? So then I guess that way we can put into practice, if they're building on a contaminated site, that they actually did clean it up, because there's going to be people living there.
Well, right now, I'm sorry, Yadira, go on.
And then I guess we'll know what the response is to the question that I had earlier. If they do build and this area was contaminated, if they're just going to get a fine if they pay for it, then they just move on forward, right?
So I can tell you right now that they are currently working on part of it. There's a lot of dirt being dug up, part of my bad English. There's a lot of dirt being dug up. They've told us that it's going to be, 5 to 7 years out before development can begin. And I remember asking them that question specifically. You're aware that the land is contaminated, and how are you going to clean it up? And Yadira, you might know his name better than mine. I don't know if it's Miguel or Manuel or Pepe or whatever. He said, yes, we're aware of that and we're paying for it. So we're moving on to this. And he didn't want to address it anymore. And I didn't press it. But yeah, I mean, a lot of land's already being dug up along that area. And Yadira, I don't know if you were in on those calls, but the Fox people did say, again, as I previously mentioned, that there would be apartments, probably townhomes, and retail built in that area.
Yeah, if you're asking me, yes, I was in that conversation. In the beginning, I dropped off because there was just too much going on in our community, but yeah, everything that you're saying that they're supposed to be putting on top of this contaminated land, yes, that's exactly what they're offering the community in 6 to 7 years from now, apparently.
And then if you didn't see the chat, Alma wrote that they've been working on a community benefits agreement, but they didn't mention the OU3 agreement.
So then, Jesse, you guys already know, or you don't know what the contaminants are in this land?
We have not reached that, the contaminants of concern, that it's part of the record of decision, so we don't have that yet.
Okay. How long does it take for this if they're already in the process?
Their process doesn't go with our process.
No, but how long does it take for the EPA to go into the land and do all of that and then determine what type of contamination is? How long does that take?
Yeah. Let me, I think I have it here. I prepare one of the slides just for this. Okay. So this is paid by the EPA. This is paid by the government, this portion of the work. We just finished the remedial investigation. The next step is the feasibility study, the one that looks at the different alternatives to clean up a site. Since that's paid by us, I have to get a contract. And I'm working on that. That process takes a year and a half for us to get a contract. That will, the way I'm setting it up, it's a contract that will go through the feasibility study. It will get us through the proposed plan and will get us then to the record of decision. And I think that process from the feasibilities to the record of decision may take about 5 years. One of the portions of that may make this longer or shorter, it's a possibility for a treatment study. We know that there is a groundwater contaminant plume that moves from here, crosses the street, and then moves northeast, parallel to the Platte River. And how to address it, we may need a treatability study to test one of the possible alternatives. And that, that could add time. And if we don't need it, if we have, paper information that is good, then that, that's a portion that we may not need. So it really depends on where things are. When can I get a contract, and then the additional steps of the process.
I wanted to add one other thing, though. The prospective purchaser who's prospective purchaser who's actually purchased the property, they have done quite a bit of their own analytical studies as far as the soil and groundwater. They did quite a bit of sampling. There's also portions where they have to do quite a bit of cleanup before Denver will allow them to do utilities. A lot of those have to do with coal-based fill that was used in the area to kind of bring it up when they were building I-25 and I-70 area. So it's not like they went in there blind. There's quite a bit of information they have before they purchase the property. And there's plans in place as far as they have very detailed materials management plans, sampling plans, things like that, to be able to develop that property. So it's not like they're going to develop it and then EPA say, oh, did you clean that up? They have to do that hand in hand with the EPA. So it's not like they're just going to do whatever they want to do. They have to work very closely with the EPA, and a lot of those details are in that modified prospective purchaser agreement.
Fonda, you said that they've done their own. Is there a record of what they might have done, or what if they did? Do you know?
Sorry, as I mute. Yeah, the original, they had a voluntary cleanup plan that came in, and because most of what they were going to do originally was just develop the portion that was south of OU3, but they decided to work with EPA and to develop the entire portion all at one time. So there is a voluntary cleanup application that has quite a bit of information that shows what's in the soil and the groundwater. And if you want to, I can send you, if you give me an email address, I can send you a link of how to be able to download that and to see that file.
I think that probably would be something good for everybody in the group and the CAG. I think that would be something that could be good information for everybody who's in the CAG here to have, not just necessarily myself,
Yeah.
but
Well,
for
the reason
public
why-
record.
Yeah, the reason why I don't have, I can't email it out. It's a huge document. So you got to download it. I wouldn't be able to send it out in the email. So I will, whoever wants to, I've got your email here that Joel provided to me. Anybody else, I can, if they send me an email, I will send them the link so they can download it. They can look at that information.
Is it on the CDPHE website on the Vasquez I-70?
No, it's in our volunteer cleanup program and our database. We have it all the sites. So that wasn't because it was a VCUP, it wasn't put in there, but I'm not sure. I can ask Shannon to see, maybe I can do that to see if she can put that on the webpage. I don't know how to do that, but
Well,
I know
can
to
I,
get you.
I want to make sure people understand that it's useful, and I think we really need to look at it, but it's useful because it talks about what they've done in the area that's not in operable unit 3 already.
Yeah, and they've actually done some work in OU3 too, because it was part of the entire property. Just that when they came into VCUP originally, they were going to do the southern half of the property and not the northern half, which contained the OU3. So that's why, but they still have information for the entire property.
Okay. Do we have time? We need to hear from Chuck before we are at 2 hours, unless Chuck has decided that we've already covered everything. Chuck?
No, I've got some stuff I can go over. First of all, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I do have a few comments I can make that might give some clarification as to what is actually in that agreement, and where people that want to look at it can find it more quickly, and highlight a couple of things that are of interest, some of which will answer some of the questions that have been being asked. You want to hear from me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I've had a chance to look through the document, get kind of a first read, and I've tried to extract some of the salient points in terms of just descriptively what they say. I will be putting together my own personal comments in response to the EPA on it, but at least this will give you a preview of what's in there, and you can read it and draw your own, put together your own comments. The pertinent parts of the Fox agreement with EPA regarding removal action to be performed under the agreement are section VII, Roman numeral 7, and in that paragraphs 33 and 36, each paragraph is numbered in the document, and then those parts in the document itself refer the reader to an Appendix 1, which is the statement of work. So what's described in paragraphs 33 and 36 will be accomplished in a manner consistent with the statement of work in Appendix 1. And the statement of work provides an outline for what is to be done to develop statements of work for what are called Phase 1 work and Phase 2 work on the Fox property. Phase 1 and Phase 2 do not identify sequential work efforts. They represent work pertaining to two different purposes. So phase one work and phase two work could conceivably be being done at the same time. Phase one work is work being done for the installation of utility infrastructure and construction. Utility construction, I infer that means. And phase two work is work pertaining to something that's called vertical redevelopment of the property. And I would guess that's got to do with not construction corridors and right-of-ways, but the buildings themselves is how I would interpret that, but it's not defined. Appendix 1, in that part 1 is a section called purpose, and this is a direct quote. The work entails environmental removal action to facilitate redevelopment of the property, which is partially located within the current estimated boundary of operable Unit 3 of the Vasquez Boulevard and Interstate 70 Superfund site. The purchaser is redeveloping the property for mixed residential and commercial use. Now, in reading through this document, the document does not appear to be in agreement to characterize the extent, distribution, and sources of contamination on the site. It does not, to me, appear to be an agreement to remediate or clean up contamination on or under this site. As written, it, to me, is an agreement of how the material that is going to be excavated or moved during phase one construction work or phase two construction work, how that material is going to be characterized and treated. Appendix 1, Part 2, which is a section that is work to be performed, touches a little bit on what is already known about the property. Again, quoting from Appendix 1 and Part 2, redevelopment of the property will require excavation and disposal of known contaminated soil, fill, and debris. Samples collected during due diligence at the property. So that is the information that Fonda was talking about, that the buyer did to educate himself. So samples collected during due diligence at the property indicated metals, specifically arsenic and lead, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's a group of chemicals that are often called PAHs, are heterogeneously distributed in the soil, fill, and debris. This removal action will address soil contaminated with these and other substances above the cleanup concentrations. Thus, Appendix 1 describes currently known contamination by a variety of organic and inorganic contaminants in each of three media, soil, fill, and debris, and that it's heterogeneously distributed. It's not isolated. It seems to be kind of hit or miss where you find it. But the statement of work will address only contaminated soils. It specifically does not say fill in the area or debris that's been put in the area. The agreement further restricts the breadth of the removal action in paragraph 33. Although the soils that will be disturbed will be as part of this agreement, will be tested for a range of contaminants identified previously during due diligence, the agreement specifies off-site removal only if there are exceedances of arsenic and lead above the thresholds identified in Appendix 1. So there are thresholds for arsenic and lead in Appendix 1, and paragraph 33, subsections A2 and B2 specify that the removal will occur only in the case of arsenic or lead being in excess of the thresholds. The agreement is further constrained in paragraph 33 by its limitation to operable unit 3. Now that does make sense because operable unit 3 is the part of the Superfund site that overlaps, and only part of the Fox property overlaps with OU3. How much it overlaps is uncertain because, as acknowledged in Appendix 1, Part 1, the limits of OU3 are uncertain, a current estimated boundary. The narrative description of OU3 in EPA documents, including, for example, the record of decision for OU1, the description of OU3 is the footprint of the smelter operation at OU3 and media outside that footprint that are impacted by contaminants from the footprint. If contamination in the soil, fill, or debris on the Fox property is sourced from OU3 operations, the boundary of OU3 would properly be extended to include that contamination. So how much is actually involved in OU3 might start with the little wedge that is currently colored purple on the map you were looking at, but depending on the characterization, and Fonda mentioned coal-derived material, which are often fines when coal is cleaned before burned. The smelter operations did create coal fines when they processed the coal that they came in before they burned it. So the existence of those on a property adjacent to a smelter raises the question of whether OU3 should be expanded out to that territory to account for that waste. But that's not discussed at all in this agreement. The only other thing I noticed that was of interest, or that caught my eye in my first look, is the thresholds for arsenic and lead. The agreement uses as removal thresholds 11 milligrams per kilogram for arsenic and 200 milligrams per kilogram for lead. Comparison for the removal action thresholds across OU1, the front and backyards of the GES community and northern Denver residents, were set in the ROD at 70 milligrams per kilogram arsenic and 40 milligrams per kilogram of lead. With respect to the threshold for cancer risk, the ROD for OU1 used a cancer risk of 10 to the minus 4, 1 in 10,000, compared to that specified in Appendix 1 of OU3, this agreement, where the Fox properties have to use as a threshold a cancer risk of 10 to the minus 6, which is 100-fold tighter or lower than was used for OU1. There's a pretty dramatic difference between the performance criteria for this agreement, which is set much, much tighter, than the performance decisions that were made on OU1. It may be that is done simply because a remedy for OU3 has not yet been produced, and so the Fox people are being held to a much tighter criterion than the people actually living in the neighborhoods when the OU1 properties were designated for cleanup or not. It may reflect Jesse's observation that cleanup criteria and things are constantly being adjusted, and that in the 20 years or 15 years since OU1, we now recognize a many-fold tighter requirement that's needed now than was perceived as being needed back then. I don't know exactly the details of what the difference is, but one thing that caught me is that where ever OU3 is going to be part of the Fox management of the property, they're going to have to remove soils that are substantially cleaner than have been removed in the Vasquez Boulevard Superfund site in the past.
And Chuck, apologies, I know you can't see the chat. We have about 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure we touch on everything. So and we can always add things to the agenda next time. So just wanted to make you aware of that.
Oh, I'm done.
Oh.
Chuck, what would you suggest that people who, first of all, these are more stringent, correct? You say tighter, you mean these standards are harder to meet and everything will be a little bit better than it was previously, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then what would you
for those properties that end up being part of OU3 as it ultimately is drawn?
Okay.
It doesn't say anything about the Fox properties other places, or for contaminants other than lead or arsenic.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of, we only have 2 weeks if we want to say something as individuals. And what occurs to me reading it is that we're signing an agreement that has no idea what's really going to be discovered as construction goes forward. Am I right? I mean, we're not signing, but this is an agreement that is really early.
Well, I have done nothing except tried to pull out what the language says, and I have not drawn conclusions yet, but I've seen nothing that would suggest when I get further into it, I would look at it differently than you just did.
And they didn't agree, I might have missed, but they didn't agree to clean up. They agreed only to follow remedies from the OU3.
As I see the language and read the language, it is a assessment of dirt that is going to be removed by virtue of development and construction on it, not a cleanup of the property to get rid of contamination ahead of development.
Okay.
If they're pulling a truckload of dirt out, they have to keep pulling dirt out until they get clean dirt, but probably only to the depth of the utility trench. What's below that depth, I don't think this agreement covers.
All right, well, I'm not sure I totally get it. To be perfectly honest, it looked to me when I read it that EPA, well, I think I heard Fonda or Jesse say EPA is still really in charge and is going to have to do the cleanup, but they're being paid by the developer to hire the contractor that EPA will supervise to clean it up? I mean, who's in charge, and will this developer pay for the cleanup of the whole cadmium plume that emanates from OU3?
Well, the cadmium plume does not go across the Fox property. So the cadmium plume is not part of this agreement.
It originates in OU3, but the northern part?
Yes, it originates on the other side of I-70.
Okay.
So the cadmium plume has no relevance as I read this. This is that part of OU3 that is ultimately under the Fox property. And that is not the cadmium plume.
Okay, so are people who are thinking of either developing there or purchasing a home there or going to live in a trust home or something, is there enough in this agreement that people can rely on that it will be addressed thoroughly, or are we counting on just sort of digging everything up, removing it, whether it's good or bad, and then figuring it out after they remove it? I'm just not sure if this gives people the protection that they're looking for.
Well, part of that would have to come from the actual statements of work, and those do not even start being drafted until after the comment period is over. So those details are out in the future, and this agreement will be locked in place before the scopes of work are done. And I have little confidence that the CAG will have an opportunity to comment on the scopes of work that result, based on the fact that EPA for months has been saying nothing has been going on in OU3, and what they really mean to say is there's nothing that we're doing in OU3 that we think the CAG has any reason to be privy to. I'm sorry, that's editorializing on my part, but we don't know, Christine, and I don't know when we will have the opportunity to know. But I doubt that the CAG will ever be able to function as a CAG. It's only going to be used as part of a public comment period.
Okay, so
That statement is actually why I say that we need to have a talk about the roles of the CAG. So we should put that in the agenda.
Yeah, but for people who live there, Jesse, should they just take a leap of faith that EPA, which hasn't really addressed cleanup here because nobody wanted to do any digging, that EPA will make sure this is protective? So I guess you're asking residents to trust that this agreement covers everything. And that's what I didn't see when I read it. It looked like it was just so preliminary before a lot of things, like the statement of work.
I want to go ahead and call attention that we are at time now. So I know we have a lot that we probably need to add to the agenda for next time and keep having conversations. I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, you can always reach out to me or anyone from EPA or CPHE to continue these. We're always happy to answer those.
Yeah, the only problem is this is our last chance to ask them. That's all.
I know. I'll leave it up to Jesse and Fonda, if they want to continue. I want to be respectful of people's time. But I also want to make sure the questions answered. And again, you can always email or, call as well to answer. But I'll leave that to Jesse and Fonda.
I can at least add a few more things as far as, the infrastructure part and stuff like that. Denver has very stringent cleanup numbers whenever they're going to be having any property that's going to be conveyed to them in the terms of either utility stuff like that. So a huge amount of this soil is going to be taken out because of the coal base fill that's in the area. Also any metals and things like that. I think the key is to look at this is to see exactly, you guys are assuming that this is a Superfund site that's got tons of contamination. If you look at the data, a lot of that's not, it's really not there. Originally, the reason why that part of the property was there, those were where all the buildings were, as far as the offices for the Argo smelter. The smelter and stuff like that was basically on the other side of north side of I-70. So I think, you know, I will give not Yadira, excuse me, I forget her name. I get the B-Cup application now, so you can see the data, and then I'll talk to Shannon about being able to put the application so it shows what exactly they found as far as soil contamination and groundwater contamination. So it'll better inform people so that they're not afraid of what's going to happen here and stuff, so that they can see that overall the property is not, there's some contamination, yes, but it's not a huge situation like there is over on the north side of I-70.
Well, I appreciate that, but Fonda, I am a lawyer and I can't even read these things easily. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible. So I guess we have to trust.
Well, I mean, Chuck can look it over. He gives his assessment also. I mean, I'm giving you my professional assessment of what I've seen thus far. They're gonna have the most important part of this is the materials management plan, how they sample things like that. Not only that, but people understand liability. They understand the contamination and stuff like that, you know, because of how the laws are and the rules are. So the people putting in hundreds of millions of dollars into this project do not want to have future liability coming back to hurt them now. That being said, will they possibly use an environmental covenant or something like that to address soils that are a certain depth that they feel is not going to be an issue to health to people? That's a possibility, but there's going to be, it'll have a detailed materials management and stuff like that. So the point being is, people that buy these properties, they don't do it just to make themselves feel good. They want to make a profit. I understand that, but at the same time is they still have to go to certain cleanup criteria so that we're not worried about what's going to happen in the future. And that's why the environmental covenants come in place too, to kind of codify what was left behind if they decide to do that.
But how can you just read paragraph 22, which says when it was tested, it showed several metals, higher concentration than background: arsenic, cadmium, copper, lead, zinc, and to a lesser extent, iron, manganese, mercury, nickel, selenium, silver, aluminum, antimony, arsenic, barium, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, copper, iron, lead, manganese, mercury, nickel, selenium, thallium, vanadium, and zinc are listed as contaminants of potential concern. I mean, how can I make sense of that?
Okay, that is based upon the work that was done in OU3. It was not based upon the property. Understand, they're buying the property that's on the southern edge, mostly, only a small part. So when you look, I mean, there's been a lot of work that was done in OU3, you know, as far as sampling soil. And what they do know is that there's metals at depth under about 10 to 15 feet of clean soil. So there is a lot of stuff needs to be done. Is there stuff on the north side? Yes. They're going to try to figure out what's going to go on. But the point I was trying to make is I've seen the data on that southern portion, what they're buying, and it's not the same as on the northern portion because of what was going on in that part of the property. That's all. And I'm going to make that accessible so people can see that data too.
All right, so I think with that, I'm going to go ahead. That's if we have extra questions, though, I would encourage you to reach out to Fonda or Jesse to answer them. But it is 7:10, and I know that Valentina also had to leave, so I want to be respectful of that as well. So I think Jesse or Fonda, anything before we wrap up?
Can't take any questions on this. Comments are sent to Julie Nicholson. There is in the notice. There is the contact information where you can do it, or in regulations.gov.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.